We have these gifted people on this earth who can take something in their mind and with symbols and lines and dots, they can put it on paper. We have these other gifted people who can take that and they can lift up an instrument and through their fingers, they embody that. And it's no longer words on a page, it's life, it's music. Our gift is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit who takes the markings on paper, makes it come to life, embodies it for us, and then asks us to embody that, to hear the music of God, to dance to the music of God, and together with Him, allow Him to make that music through us. It can be beautiful and good and true.
I think this is a bit of maybe a controversial statement, but I think the church is a good plan. I still have some hope in this thing we call the church. I think there's no other organization, a group of people organized that can do what the church can do. The possibilities of what we can participate in together is incredible. And I believe this because I think of all the experiences I've had. I'm not pretending here. I know that we've messed this up a lot. I'm not just our church, but the church is not in a great footing right now. We don't have a great reputation. I don't even know this, but the church does not have a great reputation outside of itself in these days. I want to tell you some stories. Actually, there was this church that I met a few years ago, and they were a small church, about 15, 20 people. They primarily gathered in homes and lived in a neighborhood together. And the reason for their existence, they felt, was to be a blessing to their actual neighbors, to take care of their neighbors. And they had been this way, kind of been a community like this for about 10 years. And one time they were gathered around, they were thinking about their neighbors and their neighborhood was going through a season where there was a lot of needs. They were really broken over some of the things that their neighbors were walking through, and they wanted to help. But in the midst of it, they felt just like they couldn't do enough. And someone in the group had the courage, the vulnerability to speak up and say, I would like to be able to help more of my neighbors, but I am really burdened by debt. How vulnerable, right, to say that to somebody else. And somebody else in the group said, me too. And then someone else in the group said, me too. And as it happens, there's an accountant actually in this group who spoke up and was like, I wonder how much money just in interest we're blowing on debt collectively. And so the group got really vulnerable, and they all wrote on a piece of paper how much debt they had and threw it on a coffee table in the middle. And the accountant took all of those numbers and figured out that collectively they were spending thousands of dollars a month just paying the interest on their debts. And then somebody had an idea. What if we helped pay off each other's debts so that we could be giving this money to our neighbors rather than the bank? And collectively as a community, they did a community snowball. Anybody know what a snowball? Snowball is a strategy of paying off personal debt. Maybe you've seen this before. It's if you have a stack of debts, maybe you've got 5 or 6 debts that you're paying on. You pay the minimum on the 4 of them, and then you pay as much as you can on the smallest one. And then when that smallest one is paid off, you take all of that money and snowball it onto the next one and the next one and the next one. It's a debt consolidation strategy. They did this together. And so they collectively figured out the debts. They ranked them from the smallest to the biggest. They paid the minimums on all of these debts and then snowballed their debts together. Within a few years, they had paid off all of the debt in their community and were able to be incredibly generous with that money in the neighborhood. About a decade ago, I had an opportunity to spend 2 months with this church in Guatemala City called CCCG. I don't know what any of those letters stand for. They're a local Guatemalan expression of church. And they felt called start a church on the side of a ravine, this really poor ravine. I've walked down the ravine and been in these homes. It's a really tough place. But this ravine, this neighborhood, was run by gangs. And there was a lot of violence that would go on in the neighborhood. And one day, actually, there was a shooting outside of the church with a young child. And the church said, this is not right. And so they built this kind of shed down below, and it became their prayer shed. And they would go there and pray and just seek God. And like, how do we be faithful to what you're doing on the side of this ravine? And they came up with this idea that maybe we could just start by feeding all the kids in the neighborhood. So he started this feeding program in the neighborhood where they were feeding all the children. What was interesting, though, is the gangs began to protect the church because the kids they were feeding were their little brothers and sisters. But what also began to happen is the gangs used to use the kids to run guns and drugs through the neighborhood because the police couldn't do anything to them. But now the kids, because they were eating, didn't need to join the gangs to live their life. And over the course of about a decade, the gangs began to pull out of that neighborhood and provide some new life and freedom for neighbors. I was sitting with a friend this week who is really working hard to get their life to a healthy place, but really, really having some tangible struggles. And as we were talking, I sat back in my seat for a minute and I said to my friend, I said, let's try something. Imagine what your life would look like if you were really healthy. Imagine what your life would look like if over the next couple years, everything kind of worked out and you were a really healthy person. And their face just changed with a bit of a smile and joy as they began to describe to me what that life would look like. See, I think that the church is a beautiful thing. The church is the kind of place where people can come up with really creative ideas to get people out of debt so that they can give more money away. That the church is the kind of place that can come with really complex situations like gangs on the side of a ravine in a neighborhood of Guatemala. And the church is the kind of place that can hold people and behold people in the midst of some of their hardest seasons of life and walk with them towards a beautiful future. The challenge, I think, is we struggle with imagination. That a lot of us have a hard time even imagining a more beautiful world. And that imagination is our cap on the beautiful story of God that we can participate in. And so we want to take just a few moments today. They're coming up here because we're going to sing again. False start. But on your seat is a blue card. If you don't mind, just grab that card. And I think there's a pen nearby somewhere. You can use your own. It doesn't really matter. But I wonder, probably in the room today represents a lot of different scenarios, situations, maybe roadblocks, ceilings on your life, relationships that are hard, situations that are difficult, where you'd love to be able to imagine a little more beauty into that situation, into that relationship, into that challenge. And so as we sing this next song, I just want to invite you to write a word or a sentence or a book on that card. Maybe draw a picture, it could be a symbol, but something that maybe represents an area in your life where you're struggling to see beauty. That if maybe you could imagine a little bit of beauty in that situation, you might be able to imagine what God would be inviting you into. So as we sing, I encourage you to put something on that card. Somewhere where you'd like a little help imagining a little more beauty.
In the beginning, they were. From them, there was beauty, truth, and goodness. From beauty, truth, and goodness, everything was made. From those three ingredients spring forth creation, water, land, people, personality, culture, art, technology, and each of us. The histories and myths surrounding the alchemists echo their own genesis. Like their creator before them, these humans aimed to use fundamental, pure ingredients to create something wonderful. They chased three results: transmutation of common metal into gold. Panacea, a perfect universal medicine. The elixir of life, granting immortality. Inevitably, their efforts failed, but their creator works toward the same purposes. Transmutation, the common transformed into the exceptional. Panacea, universal hope and healing for anyone in any circumstance. The elixir of life, freedom from our flaws, so that we may become more like the divine. We are invited to work alongside the Creator. Through God, the commoner is priest, princess, and icon. Through God, all are healed. Through God, we are given life unlimited. This is the creation.
Creation stories have been a powerful piece of people's identity throughout history. The story that we've been looking at over the last few weeks comes from a people in a time of slavery. God's people are being enslaved by Egyptians, by Egypt. They're working and working and working and working and struggling with their identity. Who are we in the midst of all of this? And the story that begins to emerge opens up like this. When God began to create the heavens and earth, the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters. It actually probably reads better like this. When God, that word God is this word Elohim, which is a plural word, and a word that would have been native to their people. So it would have felt like when our God, our community God, began to create the heavens and earth, the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over the deep sea. In God's wind, the word here is ruah, which sometimes is translated as breath or spirit. Our God's ruah, our God's spirit, swept over the waters. And the author breaks into a poem that begins to tell a story of a God who separates the darkness from the day, the night from the day. And then the second day, this God separates the skies from the seas. And the third day, this God separates the ground from the vegetation, the things that come up from the ground. Oh, but then on day 4, God starts filling these voids with this beautiful ecosystem that makes it all work together. That in the midst of the day and the night, God places the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky. I swear. Okay, it's fine. A couple people, that's all right. I got more people last service with that one. Appreciate it. But then on the next day of creation, God is now filling the seas and the skies with birds and fish. Then on the 6th day of creation, God places humanity and animals to walk the ground and care for the ground and be a part of this ecosystem. But actually, the real power in this story, I think, comes next. Genesis 2:1-4 says, the heavens and the earth and all who live in them were completed. On the 6th day, God completed all the work he had done. On the 7th day, God rested from all the work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, which is this way of saying that God set apart that day for a different purpose than the other 6 days. Because on it, God rested from the work of creation. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Now, I want you to imagine with me what it might have been like to be God's people under the slaved hand of Pharaoh. God's people in Egypt under slavery. In 6 days, they built bricks. But on the 7th day, they were allowed to practice their religion and they would rest. That this 7th day of creation was not about a religious rule to follow, but resting was a protest. Resting was a resistance that the world that Pharaoh has created for us is not the world that God has imagined for us. So on the 7th day, they rested, they Sabbathed, they resisted, they protested the way the world was. It was quite a while longer that God's people eventually were rescued out of slavery by this man named Moses, and they spent years wandering this desert together, talking about someday God is going to give us a land of our own where we can settle and be God's people. And as they're moving towards that land, this book gets written. It's the book of Leviticus. Has anyone ever tried to read the Bible from cover to cover and fail? You probably failed at the book of Leviticus. That's about when you are like, all right, this was a great idea on January 1st, but now it's February 30th, and this book sucks. Okay, that's what it feels like. It's like it's kind of like studying for your driver's test, but way worse. It's just rule after rule after law, and contextually, it's like hard to navigate, being like, in a totally different world now. But there's this chapter in the book of Leviticus 25. And this chapter describes this like bigger rhythm that the people are supposed to take on the land. Leviticus 25 opens up this way, that the Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai. So as God's people are wandering the desert, Moses would sometimes go up on Mount Sinai to meet with God, and God would say things to Moses. He said, speak to the Israelites, to my people, and say to them that once you enter the land I'm giving you, the land must celebrate a Sabbath rest to the Lord. So once you get there, right, there's going to be all these systems that take place. Over time, systems and structures will build. You'll build governments and a way of life and businesses together. But it's going to be important that every 7 years, that as a system, as a community, you give the whole thing a rest. A break, a resistance, a bit of a protest about maybe some of the things that have become that aren't supposed to be that way. Now, I would love to be able to stand up here and read all of Leviticus 25, but by the time I was done, you'd either be asleep or you would have just left, okay? So I want to tell you a little bit about Leviticus 25. So Leviticus 25 talks about this 7-year rhythm. That every 7 years, you're supposed to give the land a rest. And what this looks like is there was laws about leaving parts of the farmland unharvested. And then during that year, like if you needed to do a little bit of stuff to the land, there was you weren't allowed to use the regular tools that you would normally use. And so actually any farming you did have to do during that year, you'd have to be incredibly inefficient while doing it. This would drive me crazy. But the point of the law, and there's a lot of other kind of laws written in here, is that the poor then were allowed to come and eat off the land. So the idea was that in the 7th year, the year of Sabbath and rest, resistance, that those who did not share in the abundance for the previous 6 years could move across these fields and experience abundance and take whatever they needed. Sabbath, the 7th year. But then every 50 years, there was supposed to be 2 years of rest. So think about this. So on the 7th time of the 7th year, so 7 times 7 is? Oh, some of you are good at math in your head. I don't ever recommend doing that, okay? But then the 50th year would be plus 1. Okay, so get this. So you'd have the 7th time of the 7th year. That year would be rested. And then there'd be 1 more year of rest, which would be 50, which would give how many years of rest? 2 years in a row of rest. Okay, this is good. I pre-prepped the math, so don't think I'm overly good at this, all right? But during those 2 years of rest, that if there was any possessions that someone had acquired from somebody else, you're supposed to give them back during that year. This year was called the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord. And then on the 10th day of the 7th month, I know you're tracking with this, on the 10th day of the 7th month, this was called the day of confession and repentance. And on this day, during the year of Jubilee, slaves were supposed to be set free. All the slaves would be set free. And then any land that had been acquired over the course of those 50 years were supposed to go back to its original owners. You're going to return it to the people who had it in the first place. And so Leviticus 25 was some law that was trying to help people imagine some stuff. So imagine this, that people could never be forever possessions. Imagine this, that no family or sect or group could be forever poor. Imagine a system that believed the land was God's land and it was meant to be stewarded and not used. Leviticus 25 would go on to list some more laws. You know, you can't use somebody in a situation of desperation to get them to be your slave. So somebody is facing some difficult things in life. You can't use that situation to corner them into something that would be for your gain. In fact, Leviticus 25 has some laws of warning against people who were rulers, saying that if you are going to rule over somebody, you should not do that with rigor, but you should fear God. On top of that, it would say, listen, you also can't kidnap people from other nations and make them your slaves. And if at any point over the last 50 years, if someone from your people had been sold to another tribe into slavery, you need to collect the money, go to that tribe, buy them back, and set them free. I mean, can you imagine if I was running for office on Leviticus 25? I mean, some of you are uncomfortable just with me telling you this story. It's in the book. But here's what's incredible about Leviticus 25. It's never happened. The year of Jubilee has never happened. And so Leviticus 25 became an imagination text. Because trying to work out Leviticus 25 in real time, 50 years or 100 years after all of these systems and structures and would be really complicated. It'd be difficult to legislate Leviticus 25. And so over time, Leviticus 25 became this text for God's people. That as they encountered different situations in life and they began to imagine, what kind of world does God dream about? Leviticus 25 would help them navigate that in real time. So in the theme of Genesis 1, in Leviticus 25, God's people are invited to imagine another world that could be possible. Years later, God's people are in the land, but they're under captivity. Under captivity, so another people have come and overtaken them and are oppressing God's people on the land that was given to them. And in the midst of that, Isaiah, a prophet among those people, wrote this poem or this decree, Isaiah 61. I want to look at this with you. Isaiah 61 says this, the Lord God's Spirit, Ruah. The Lord God's Ruah. What do you think Isaiah 61 is referencing out of the gate? Genesis 1. This Spirit, Ruah, is upon me. The Spirit that was in Genesis 1 is upon me. Because the Lord has anointed me, he has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up brokenhearted and proclaim release to captives and liberation for prisoners. And then it says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What's Isaiah talking about? Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee. So Isaiah is saying, hey everybody, we're under some pretty tough times right now. Let me invite you into the long-standing tradition of imagination. Let's imagine together this God of Genesis 21 and the imagination of Leviticus 25 and see if we can navigate these times together. It says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, a day of vindication for our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide Zion's mourners, to give them a crown in place of ashes, oil in place of mourning, a mantle of praise in place of discouragement. They will be called oaks of righteousness planted by the Lord to glorify himself. Can you just imagine this text being spoken out loud in the midst of this time? They will rebuild ancient ruins. They will restore formerly deserted places. They will renew ruined cities, places deserted in generations past. Foreigners will stay and shepherd your sheep, and strangers will be your farmers and vine dressers. You will be called priests of the Lord, ministers of our God. They will say about you, you will feed on the wealth of nations and fatten yourselves in their riches. Instead of shame, the portion will be doubled. Instead of disgrace, they will rejoice and share. They will possess double portion in their land, and everlasting joy will be theirs. I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and dishonesty. I will faithfully give them their wage and make with them an enduring covenant. Their offspring will be known among the nations, and their descendants among the people. All who see them will recognize that they are a people blessed by God. I mean, Isaiah 61 is proclaiming a way of life that is unimaginable at this time. And Isaiah is saying, listen, the systems that we build together, the way we do this together, the things that we do together is how everyone will know that we are of the Lord, that we are people of the Jubilee, that we are people who proclaim the year of the Lord's favor in every day of our life. I surely rejoice, he goes on to say, my heart is joyful because of my God, because he has clothed me with clothes of victory, wrapped me in a robe of righteousness, like a bridegroom in a priestly crown, and like a bride adorned in jewelry. As the earth puts out its growth, as a garden grows its seeds, so the Lord God will grow righteousness and praise before all the nations. Again, in the tradition of Genesis 1, in Leviticus 25, Isaiah comes forth with this imagination, this God-sized imagination for the world, a world that we have and are also called and invited to co-create. That another world is possible. Another world is possible. Jesus, as he incarnated into our world, spent like 30 years doing just about nothing. And then he went and got baptized. This is why we baptize people here. It's this practice in the way of Jesus that we've continued on for thousands of years. He got baptized. He went into the wilderness, right? All of these kind of symbols of the journeys that God had brought in God's people through in the past. Then he comes back into the city, empowered by the Spirit of God, and shows up at some temples, some places of religious worship, Jewish worship. And Luke 4 describes Jesus' early moments in the temple like this. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit, there's that word again, to Galilee. And news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been raised, on the Sabbath day, the seventh day. Why did you think that might be important? He went to the synagogue as he normally did and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him a scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." What's the year of the Lord's favor? Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee. And then he rolls up the scroll and gave it back to the synagogue assistant and sat down. That's the ancient version of dropping the mic. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. Of course it was. I mean, this is a huge statement Jesus is making. And he says, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled, just as you have heard it." I mean, Jesus is saying, can you still imagine it? Can you still see that another world is possible? I mean, we're all living in this life right now, and I think we all kind of feel like this can't be it, right? Like, this can't be the world that God has imagined. This can't be what comes from this beautiful creation in Genesis chapter 1 and this beautiful projection of how people can live together in Leviticus 25, in this ancient text that has been so important to our people in Isaiah 61. This life that we're living, this can't be it. And Jesus is saying, can you imagine another world is possible? But he's saying more than that, isn't he? He's actually saying, I am doing the work of Genesis 1 and Leviticus 25 and Isaiah 61. But he's saying more than that, isn't he? He's actually saying, I'm here to fulfill Genesis 1, Leviticus 25, and Isaiah 61. I mean, this claim that Jesus is making is huge. He's saying, center your life around me, and we will do this work together. That I am the one, it's in me, that will lead us to, that will center us on imagining the world that God dreamed, and we'll do it together. We'll build it together. I think this imagination becomes incredibly important in the early church. I mean, when you think about some of these early statements in the book of Acts, there'll be these statements where their life together is described, and then it'll close off with, and guess what? No one had any needs among them. That wasn't some like religious response. It wasn't some like, power-hungry pastor saying, you got to give all your money to this. It was a group of people imagining a different future and going, wait a minute. It's kind of weird that I've got a lot of stuff and this brother or sister of mine is starving. That doesn't sound like the world that God created. That doesn't sound like the tradition of Genesis 1, Leviticus 25, and Isaiah 61. It doesn't sound like the thing that Jesus proclaimed in the temple that day. And so people were literally selling their property, like their future. This would be the version of like cashing out your retirement so that this person over here could eat. This is the kind of stuff they were doing. 4 centuries later, Roman Emperor Julian has this famous quote about the church. He talks about Christians as atheists because to be a theist was to worship him. And so Christians were atheists. And he said these atheists, they're expanding rapidly. And so among rulers of the time, there was some anxiety about how quickly the church was growing in power. This is why we have so many early forms of early Christian leaders being killed. They were hoping that would slow it down, but it didn't work. So this emperor, he says these atheists, the reason they're growing so much is because there's no one among them who has any needs at all. They take care of their poor. But then he goes on to say, more than that, they're also taking care of our poor. They're taking care of their enemies' poor. How does a group of people do this? It's because they have an imagination for the kind of world that God dreams up, an imagination in the tradition of Genesis 21 and Leviticus 25 and Isaiah 61 and Luke 4. They have an imagination for what that world is like, and when they see the distance in between, they begin working in the gap of that imagination. So if we want to build a better world, if we want to build a different world, we have to have an imagination that another way is possible. And this is why I still have so much hope in the church. Because even as I look around this room, I know there are people in this room that have been under the bondage of addictions before, but began to have an imagination for another kind of life and now are free of that. That I know in this room there are people who have had relationships restored that should have never been restored, but they have an imagination for another world being possible. That there are people in this room that have had deep wounds healed, that should have never been healed, that begun with an imagination that another way is possible. And this is why, as a church, I want to be unapologetically optimistic about grace. That we believe another world is possible. And if you can't believe it yet for you, you can come and hang out with us and we'll believe it for you. That we'll imagine this world with you and walk with you as we pursue it together. This is actually what baptism is, right? Baptism is not, there's no magic in the water up here. I don't know if anyone told you there was. There's none. Like we just filled it up with a hose. That's it. But as people get baptized, it's a marking of what is about to come. It's saying I'm buying into the imagination of this Jesus-centered future. I'm buying into what it means for my life right now, but what it's going to mean tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. And the reason we do this together is because we're all going to buy into that imagination with you. You don't have to imagine this world alone. We're going to imagine it too. It's why we do these things called tables. So right now, I don't know if you've been around where like people are signing up for these tables. And here's what's wild, that in the church, that we're able to organize these tables, and people who don't know each other will get together in each other's homes and eat together. I mean, the conversation socially right now is that we are in a pandemic of loneliness. That people are incredibly divided over every line you can imagine. But we have an imagination for a world that's not like that. And so people are like, yeah, I'll open up my home to anybody who wants to come over and eat. And I'll sit and share a meal with someone who's got different political views than I do, someone who's got different religious views than I do, someone who's got different theological imaginations than I do. I mean, we're talking about the divine, right? But then more than that, there's a table organizing right now. They're going to get together and they're going to share in a meal together. And then after they eat, they're going to clean toys. They're going to go into a store in the mall so that parents who can't afford to buy Christmas gifts for their kids can actually with dignity go and pick out Christmas gifts for their kids and give it to their kids from them. Because we together are imagining a world where kids on Christmas morning get Christmas gifts, but not just that they get them from their parents. Because it's a terrible idea that a kid and a parent would not get to share in that moment together. And as we imagine other world possible, we can share in meals and clean gifts and make a store. There's a group of people that are gathering a table of folks who have some kind of proximity to recovery. And we imagine a world together where we don't put the people in recovery into some basement room in the church. Did you know there's a basement here? But they'll actually just sit together around a table having a feast together, sharing in life together. We imagine that world is possible, and we'll work towards that end. I'm going to tell you one more story. About 20 years ago, and some of these old-time Westwinders, I promise you my history is a little off, and you can just correct me later. But somewhere around 20 years ago, Westwinds Church helped start another church in North Carolina, and so we sent a bunch of money, and we did some training, and some people went and started this church in North Carolina. One of the things that we've actually shared in, we haven't had a lot of relationship over the last 20 years, but one of the things we've shared in is a relationship with someone named Thang Lal in Southeast Asia. Thang Lal is a pastor from some of the lowest castes of people in India. And so both of our churches have been supporting Thang Lal monthly for like 20 years. And this week I had a conversation, the pastor of that church, the now pastor of that church, reached out to me and said, hey, do you know what's going on with Thang Lal? And I didn't. Been sharing some really tough things that are going on in Thang Lal's life. And I said, hey, I'd love to know more about that. And so Thang Lal sent us an email, letter to the church this week. And I want to read this to us. Some of the words and numbers are odd. English is not Thang Lal's first language. So if you're, again, doing math in your head, I wouldn't recommend it. But it says, Dear Michelle is who works in the office here at the church. As you must be aware what's happening in Manipur, India, hundreds of churches are torched down. I cried last service too. And thousands of houses and property of tribal Christians, my community, have been stolen, burnt, demolished since the last 5 months by this Majorian community. It's sad when churches where I've preached, taught, sang are now in heaps of ashes. Now there are nearly 60,000 refugees and about 100,000 others are displaced all over India, and mostly in my community. There are 2,500 to 3,000 refugees who have taken shelter in my city here in Guwahati. I alone sheltered 10 pastors' families, and another hundreds of them have stayed with me for up to 3 months. Some 1 month, some for a few weeks, but they have no other place to go. Because of giving shelter to these tribal Christians, my people have faced consequences from surrounding community leaders complaining to police, and police have already begun to probe us. I have totally run out of resources by feeding more than 100 people for 5 months. I've spent all of my family savings. Now Matt, this is the pastor in North Carolina, has sent me some help, which was relief, but it didn't last long. There is more need. If there is any possibility for Westwinds to extend some more help so I can continue to feed my family and people who are taking refuge under my roof and pay for my children's school fees and a medical checkup I have to go to and some medicine and some groceries. I know Westwinds is sending regular support for which we are able to serve the Lord and grow grace. Any amount will help and will add more life to me and the community I serve. When we first encountered Thang Lo, it was years and years ago on a trip to India, and Thang Lo was a 15-year-old interpreter for the group. And then he went to Bible college and started this ministry and primarily operated this ministry out of his home. It was like a small kind of tin roof, really simple, small space. He would host seminars and trainings and walk with people in his home. His family lived there. Everything was there. But 7 years ago, maybe it was a little shorter than that, 5 years ago, some people in this church in North Carolina and some people at Westwinds got together and built Thang Lo a house, a larger house, so that his kids could have a room separate from them, and so that he could host more of these trainings and gatherings and support. And Thang Lo does some incredible work. I mean, he supports pastors, but he's also supporting like local therapists and counselors, and he's always looking for resources on how to help people through like trauma. He does some really amazing work. But as this place where he's from is under civil war, he's now back to living in one room with his family because hundreds of people are coming through his house, and he's just is feeding them with everything he has, emptying his bank account to feed, and he's out of money. He's all the way out. So here's something else that went on. A couple years ago, somebody at Westwinds wrote a check for $1,000 and said, I don't know where this needs to go, but I want it to go to missions. And when I got here, we reorganized just kind of how cash flows through our organization. But there was this money that was marked for missions. And it's really important as a church that when someone gives money to a specific intent, that we keep that separate for that intent. So we opened up a whole other bank account and just put that $1,000 in it so we could figure out what it was supposed to do. This week, as I was reading this letter and talking with our elders and praying with our elders, like, that's what that money's for, right? And so this week, we're going to send that $1,000 to Thang Lo and just kind of get him out of this hole. But we're going to be able to walk with him as long as this goes on. We're going to stick it out. But this is why I think the church is beautiful. From some church planners that came from Westwinds Church to North Carolina, to a trip meeting a translator at 15 years old, to building a house for a family that has faithfully been serving its community for a super long time, to somebody who gave $1,000 just because I got to get this out of my bank account because I have a sense that if it stays there, I'm going to spend it when I'm supposed to spend it on. We're going to put it over here for some kind of jubilee type thing, right? To a moment where this relationship has been built up, where Thang Lo has the courage to reach out and say, I need help. Like I'm in desperate need of help. I still believe in the church. I do, friends. I hope that we are a place that lives out Jubilee, that we would live in the tradition of Genesis 1 and Leviticus 25 and Isaiah 61 and Luke 4, that we'd be a people that see debts forgiven and wounds healed, refugees housed, addictions losing power, where relationships are restored, strangers are becoming friends, and kids are getting Christmas gifts from their parents. This is why I believe in the church. What other institution can have an imagination for a world like that and work together across political lines, across religious lines, against all whatever dumb lines exist in our life, to move towards this future that God has imagined in the way of Jesus? And so today we're going to spend just a few minutes. I'm sorry, we went over time last service too, and I got in trouble, but I want us to spend a few minutes kind of processing this in the way that God's people have often processed these kinds of things. So that we remember God's faithfulness in the past and imagine the future and move forward in courage. And so we're going to sing a couple songs that are just about God's faithfulness in our past. And as we sing, I just want to encourage you to maybe remember some of these maybe anchor moments in your life. And at some point as we sing, maybe transition your imagination to something in your life or something in your world where you can imagine a more beautiful way. And be curious about how God might be inviting you in to joining him in creating beauty into this world. Let's sing together.